Hello, don't mind me just using my monitor as a mirror. Can't see what the screen is until the message goes out of the way to tell you that you're going live. So hopefully we are live. Hi, I'm going to give it a couple of minutes just for people to start filtering through. Um, but do let me know in the chat that you're here, that you can hear me. Say hi if you want to tell me like where you're tuning in from or something. That would be cool. And yeah, we'll just give it a couple of minutes and then dig into the book. Very exciting, and yeah, happy to be here talking to you about it today. So just going to give it a couple of minutes. See numbers going up and down, people flicking in and out. Do say hey if you're watching. We're going to get started in just a couple of minutes, just giving people a little bit of time to sort of filter through, and realizing I should have opened a window before I started because it's absolutely baking in this office. Apparently it's 24 degrees. Do say hi if you can hear me, if you're watching in the chat. And then I'll make a start. Hi, Jenna. Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, it's 2 minutes past, and I have at least one person in the audience that I know of, so I'm just going to get cracking. And I believe that live videos will still be on YouTube after they've been recorded, I think. So hopefully I'll be able to direct people back to this video later as well. So yeah, people will be able to see what the book's all about. I'm going to do some reading from the book. I'm going to do a Q&A. I've got a couple of questions that have been given to me. So thanks for watching. The book was released yesterday. Very exciting, 2nd of September. It's on Kindle and paperback, and that's on Amazon, of course. And it's part guide, part kind of memoir. They're kind of interwoven into each other. And it's all about CMMRD, which you may know about if you're watching this video anyway. So as I say, I'm going to do a couple of readings. And I think that the best place to start is just by explaining what CMMRD is. And the best way that I can think to do that is by reading an extract from the book, or let me just show you the book as well so that you can see. Ignore the line going through it. That's my proof copy. I'm waiting on my exciting author copies to arrive. So I'm going to read from the chapter, What is CMMRD? So, and I'm reading from my screen because my proof copy is different because I've edited since then. So, I am 1 in a million. That's not me being conceited. I literally am. While rare conditions are those that affect less than 1 in 2,000 people, ultra rare conditions affect 1 in 50,000. This puts CMMRD in a league of its own as it affects an estimated 1 in a million patients. That's right, I'm 1 in a million. You heard it here first. Except you perhaps didn't, as I use that line all the time. In fact, as my partner was quick to research, those odds are somewhere between getting 5 numbers and 5 numbers and a bonus ball on the national lottery. But what is CMMRD? It stands for Constitutional Mismatch Repair Deficiency, and it's a genetic condition that increases a person's risk of getting different types of cancer. It's related to another genetic condition called Lynch syndrome, which also increases cancer risk. But while Lynch syndrome occurs when a person inherits faulty genes from one parent, CMMRD occurs when both parents have Lynch syndrome and the person inherits faulty genes from both parents. To understand how CMMRD is inherited, let's first explain Lynch syndrome further. Lynch syndrome is a genetic condition that increases a person's cancer risk. It used to be known as hereditary non-polyposis colorectal cancer, or HNPCC. People with Lynch syndrome have an up to 80% risk of getting bowel cancer. It can also increase the risk of getting gynecological, stomach, kidney, liver, skin, and brain cancer, depending on which of your genes are affected. These genes are called MLH1, MSH2, MSH6, PMS2, and EpCAM. And if you have Lynch syndrome in the family, you may have come across these names. These are mismatch repair genes. Mismatch repair genes repair mistakes that occur during DNA replication. As they look for mistakes and correct them, I like to think of these genes as the editors or proof of our bodies. Imagine a tiny person sitting at a desk inside your body with stacks of paper piled high in front of them. That person is your editor, your mismatch repair gene. And the paper is the DNA that needs to be checked. The editor takes their red pen and corrects all of the mistakes. For a real editor, these may be spelling errors, grammatical errors, inconsistencies, or incorrect facts. Mismatch repair genes, the editors of your DNA, will be correcting mistakes in DNA replication that could otherwise lead to cancer if left uncorrected. Of course, for a real editor, the stakes are not very high. A spelling mistake in a book or newspaper isn't a matter of life or death. Mistakes in DNA, however, can be catastrophic. This is why your MMR genes are so important. The editor finishes the corrections and the paper is taken away so that the printed publication can be finished correctly, or so that your DNA can be repaired and all is well. Because they repair DNA, mismatch repair genes help prevent us from getting cancer, which I suppose in this metaphor is the worst possible grammatical error, even worse than mixing up your and your. Lynch syndrome is when these mismatch repair genes or editors are broken due to alterations or mutations, so they don't do their job properly. Imagine the editor's desk is empty, or they're sleeping at their desk, or making paper aeroplanes instead of working. However you think of it, the editor or MMR gene is not doing its job, leaving mistakes uncorrected and increasing cancer risk. We each inherit 2 copies of each gene from our parents, and in the book there is a nice little diagram to show this. So if your mother has Lynch syndrome, in other words, one of her 2 copies of the genes has a mutation, and your father does not have Lynch syndrome, you might inherit a normal gene from each parent and not have Lynch syndrome. Or you might inherit your mother's mutated gene and also have Lynch syndrome. The chances of getting Lynch syndrome if one parent has it are 50%. It's worth noting here that Lynch syndrome itself is not rare. It's estimated that 1 in 400 people in the UK have Lynch syndrome, but only 5% know they have it. The other 95% are wandering around oblivious to their increased cancer risk. Though with an increased focus on genetic screening, it's hoped the tide is changing on this. Now that we understand Lynch syndrome, we can explain what CMMRD is by thinking again about families and how these problems with the genes are passed on. We've talked about what could happen if one parent has Lynch syndrome, but what if they both have it, like mine? The mother has one normal gene and one with a mutation. So does the father. The child might therefore inherit the mother's normal gene and the father's normal gene and not have Lynch syndrome at all. This is what happened with my sister. Great news, as it means she didn't pass it on to her children. Or the children might have inherited the mother's normal gene and the father's mutated gene, or the mother's mutated gene and the father's normal gene. This would mean they have one normal gene and one mutation, and would therefore have Lynch syndrome. Finally, there's those who inherit their mother's mutated gene and their father's mutated gene, like me, and like my brother, who died from a brain tumour at age 16 when I was 1 year old. These people have CMMRD, or constitutional mismatch repair deficiency. CMMRD almost always results in childhood or early adult cancer. Nearly everyone with CMMRD gets cancer before the age of 18. The average age for getting cancer with CMMRD is just 7.5 years old. At the age of 35, I feel like I'm beating the odds pretty well, though I've had 3 different types of cancer so far. So the book is factual. So as you can see, it's partly a guide, but you can also see that memoir and my personal experience is interwoven into that as well. And there's also poetry, which I will touch on later too. So it acts as a guide as to what CMMRD is. But the driver for me has always been writing more specifically about denial and acceptance. Because it's taken me an awful long time to get to a place where I can say, yes, I have CMMRD and I'm comfortable thinking about that. So in 2021, I released my first memoir, Gut Feelings Coping with Cancer and Living with Lynch Syndrome. And you would notice that CMMRD is not in the title of that book and it isn't mentioned anywhere in the book at all. And I wanted to do something, not exactly setting the record straight, but something that acknowledged CMMRD. And I also noticed that there isn't a book about CMMRD out there at the moment. So I really wanted to write the first one, to write something for us, for the CMMRD community, to give people something to look at, something to be able to empathize with, and yeah, try and cultivate that kind of understanding, not just between people in the community, but for healthcare professionals who want to know more about patient experience, and for anybody else interested in genomics as well. And hopefully it sets out quite clearly um, the genetic side of things, as much as I know, because I'm not a medical professional or a scientist, so it's what I know as much as I can as a patient. So because it's part kind of factual guide and part memoir, and the acceptance part is so important and is really it's the driver that made me realize what angle I should take with the book. I want to read another shorter section from the What is Acceptance chapter. I had assumed I had accepted cancer and Lynch syndrome, and it wasn't until I interrogated my innermost workings a little deeper that I realized I hadn't really accepted it at all. I was getting knowledge confused with acceptance, and knowing something is going to happen and accepting it are two different things. Even if you acknowledge that something is happening and agree to deal with it and make accommodations so that it can happen, that isn't necessarily acceptance. And I needed acceptance because it was so difficult to be pulled from normal daily life into the medical world every time a new appointment or set of results cropped up. I was treating each appointment, surgery, screening, and cancer diagnosis as an individual event rather than part of a whole. The whole, of course, being CMMRD, though I didn't think about it in those exact terms at the time. I wondered if it would be helpful for me to accept that I was a person with CMMRD, that CMMRD was an ongoing thing that was always there, rather than something that came and went like a horrible tide, pulling scalpels and hospital gowns to my shores when I least expected it. I often felt as if I was straddling two worlds, trying to exist in the normal world while the medical world was waiting for me and could pounce at any moment. I would be in the office at the digital marketing agency where I worked at the time, and I would get a phone call from the hospital asking me to book in for an appointment. All of a sudden, I'm not thinking about writing blog posts or emailing my clients. I'm once again considering the prospect of the cancer returning and having to ask my boss for time off to go to my screening. But what if I didn't have to deal with it all bit by bit? After all, you don't need to worry about returning to the medical world if you never leave it. Is that really better? At first, I thought it was admitting defeat to resign myself to the reality that I would always be going back and forth to the hospital. But acceptance is not defeat. It could, in fact, mean more peace of mind. So that gives you a bit of a taster of what the book is like. I'm going to go through some other chapters as well, just to kind of let you know the structure of it and what else is covered. So the CEO of Bowel Research UK, my employer, the CEO Lynn Dunn has very kindly done a foreword for me. And there's the prologue, sorry, and what is CMMRD, which kind of covers a bit more about what's associated with CMMRD and what I just read. I also talk about my cancer stories in brief. I should say that my first memoir, Gut Feelings, covers it in much more detail. It's about 200 pages long, and it's everything that happened to me from 2010 to 2019. So that's a condensed version of that. I also have a chapter on myself in brief, because we're all more than our diagnoses, and it's nice to see what else, what else makes up a person. What is the context that this illness is situated in? There's also a chapter on genetic testing in more detail, more not so much general or what you should expect if you have such a diagnosis, but what happened to me, because that's what I know best. And then chapters on acceptance. So what is acceptance? Going from denial to definition. What my turning point was, which I won't share here. You'll have to read the book to find out what the turning point was. And then some thoughts on CMMRD for different people. So how there's no right or wrong in dealing with it. Thoughts for parents and families. What do people with CMMRD need? And some final words of advice, resources, references, and so on. So I'm going to move on to the Q&A. So I've got a few questions that I already had. If you have any questions and you're listening live, do pop them in the chat if you have any, and I will have a look at those as well. So the first question that I wanted to address was, how should readers understand the poetry in the book and what is its purpose? So every chapter of the book starts with a poem or a sort of journal or blogging extract in some cases. And the reason why poetry is in the book, apart from being a huge part of who I am, and of course I'm doing my PhD in sort of creative writing and poetry, it's very much how I've explored my cancer experiences. And it started off with this book with one poem that I definitely wanted to put in the book, and then it kind of expanded into, well, let's do a poem for every chapter. Let's find an appropriate poem that I've written for every chapter. So the poem that I definitely wanted to put in, I'm going to read to you. It's called Coming to Terms. And that was actually one of the titles that I considered for writing the book, was going to be Coming to Terms. And I'll explain as well why that changed. But this is the poem Coming to Terms. I am coming to terms with the diagnosis I received over 10 years ago. Years later, I'm still trying to think it through. Like, what is coming to terms anyway? What and where are the terms, and how do we get there or come to them? Why can't the terms come to me? Why do I have to do all the work? Can't I get the terms sent to my house? They deliver everything these days. Deliveroo, Uber Eats, those little robots I see trying to cross the road. I helped one of them up a curb once, and it thanked me. Surely the terms would have fit in his little food compartment. I'm an Amazon Prime member. You're saying they won't deliver the terms to me? Yes, I'm lazy, and I know I'm skirting around the issue and not actually addressing the thing I apparently needed to come to terms with. One day I will find all the right terms to describe the issue, and maybe by then someone will have created a company called Uber Terms or Prime Terms. Tasty terms straight to your door. Pay more for priority delivery. Track your rider on the map. I hope they're in a car and not on a bike, or the size of the terms I've ordered makes me fear for their safety. So that's the main poem that I wanted to fit into the book, and you can see why it addresses sort of denial and acceptance. I have a question in the chat, so I'll go to that next. Could you say a little more about how you wrote the book and how it fits in with your PhD research? Absolutely. So for anyone who doesn't know, my PhD, I'm doing a creative writing PhD where I'm exploring my illness experiences and how I feel about all of that through poetry and prose. I'm in just about to start year 5 of 6. 'Cause I'm doing it part-time. And I think that this book probably wouldn't have come along if it wasn't for my PhD, because my PhD has made me a more prolific writer than I probably otherwise would have been. I mean, I did my master's previously, finished that back in 2017. But before I did my master's, I think that my writing was very much kind of on and off, not very frequent. I'll go through bouts of doing lots and lots of it and then just not do anything for ages. So doing my master's and my PhD has helped me to do more of it and get better at it as well. And not only that, writing in general helps me to explore how I feel about things. And I sometimes even get the odd eureka moment when I find out how I feel about something just through writing it. I'll write something and then I'll be like, oh, I didn't realize how I felt about it before I wrote it down. Oh, so that's why I think a certain way about this, or that's why this affects me, which is such a great part of writing, I think. So I started writing the book. I mean, as I say, I wanted to write another book that addressed CMMRD specifically because I had already written about Lynch syndrome. I just wanted to acknowledge that I had begun to accept CMMRD as a diagnosis, and say more about it. And of course, because nobody had written a patient-facing book solely dedicated to it before. And I was thinking about it for quite a while, but it didn't really I wasn't sure what angle to take with it, because I didn't want to just be retreading old ground. I didn't want to be saying everything that I'd already said, and just doing kind of a find and replace with Lynch syndrome to CMMRDs. Not something that I wanted to do. I wanted to make sure that I had a purpose for this book. And then I realized, when was it? I think it was July. This July, I realized that I wanted the angle to be this denial and acceptance kind of journey. And so I drafted up the book in a weekend. I mean, it's not very long. It's about 100 pages. So it didn't take too long to draft, but even for my standards, getting it done in a weekend was quite a feat. And that's just my nature. That's just how I do things. And then I've been sort of right up until yesterday been kind of editing it and putting the final touches on it, with the help of my editor, as well, Christopher John Eggett, my long-suffering editor, I should say. So yeah, that's kind of how the book came about. And I think that the PhD and the book both really help each other, and it's great to be able to be in that mind space for both of them, and for one to affect the other. And my PhD research has probably influenced the book a bit as well, just in that I'm referencing sources and making sure that everything that I'm saying is factually correct and all of that sort of stuff. So yeah, the two are very much intertwined. I hope that answers that question. So why the socks on the cover? Made the cover myself, or part of the super enjoyable and rewarding self-publishing process. So I made the cover. As you can see, it's got lots of different socks on it, and some of them are odd socks, hence mismatch. When you think of mismatch, what do you think about? I think about socks not matching. And yeah, some of these socks don't match, just like my jeans, I guess. And that's where the socks came from. Why the title, the CMMRD book? That's an interesting question because, as I said, it was potentially going to be called Coming to Terms. That was going to be a title I was considering. I was considering some others as well. But my problem was that I wanted people to know what the book was, to know what it was about just from the title. So I was like, well, Coming to Terms, yeah, it links in quite well and it's the name of a poem, but also it could kind of be about anything. And I wanted to be a bit more specific. And I was talking to Chris, my editor. We were messaging each other and we were talking about the book. We weren't talking about the title, we were talking about something else. And he just made an offhand comment. It is, after all, the CMMRD book. And I said, well, maybe that's what I should call it. Just call it the CMMRD book. It's the only one out there at the moment. Yeah, that's it. Nice and simple. Just go for that. So that's where the name came from. Somebody also asked what was the hardest part to write. And interestingly, the chapter about myself, where I'm not talking about, well, not too much about illness, and I'm talking about who else am I, who am I as a person. I'm talking about work, the jobs that I've done, my family, where we're from, where we live, what do I like, and all of that sort of stuff. What are my interests? Was probably the hardest bit to write. And actually, under Chris's advice, I did do a complete rewrite of the first draft of that because it did feel a bit kind of disjointed. And that was the hardest chapter because, well, why? That's a good question. Another thing to psychoanalyze myself about, probably. Why? Why is it harder to write about myself generally than it is to write about this kind of all-encompassing thing that I guess I've become an expert in? Does it make other things feel like I'm not an expert in them anymore, or does it make them seem like they're less important? Yeah, I don't have the answer for that yet. But yeah, that was the hardest chapter to write. And again, that fits in with my PhD as well. Because about a year into my PhD, I realized, I was planning on writing lots of poems about my cancer experiences and how I felt about them. But actually, I've spent 10 years writing about cancer and maybe I don't want to do so much of it anymore. And then the question becomes, well, what else do you write about then? What is the other thing to write about if you're not going to write about that? And, well, you're writing about yourself. Well, who else are you? And that's such a huge question. So identity as well became a massive part of my PhD, and clearly for good reason if that chapter was quite difficult to write. Somebody said, how does this book compare to the writing of memoir? Yeah, that's a good question. And as I say, I didn't want to retread old ground and just write kind of another version of my first memoir. So my first book was very much, here's what's happened to me from beginning like 2010 to 2019. Here's my illness experiences so far. And this book, obviously, I wanted it to be different. I didn't want to just say from beginning to end, here you go, because that would just be the same thing. I guess I wanted it to be, I wanted it to be a resource, and the memoir, Gut Feelings, is also a resource. And I know that people have taken comfort and been able to relate to that, which has been amazing. And I do want this book to be the same. But it's also a book about an ultra rare disease or condition that people aren't writing about, they're not talking about. So it was important to reflect not just my experiences, but what are the facts, and roughly kind of an overview of what are other people's experiences with it as well. And I can't say too much about that because, so for example, CMMRD usually or very often affects children. Children end up with a cancer diagnosis, and that hasn't been my experience, but I know that it's, that's a lot of people's experience, and a lot of people in the community are parents who are worried about their children. So while I can't speak to that, I still wanted to acknowledge it in the book and say, "Hey, yep, here's my experience, but also it's not the only experience. It's not even the most common experience. Um, here's, what other people might be experiencing. You should also go and listen to those people and see what they have to say about it." And I hope that it's the first book about CMMID, but I hope it's not the only book. What was the editing process like? It was it was easier than for gut feelings. For gut feelings, it was very difficult to retread all of that, everything that had happened. It was very emotional, very difficult, and I guess I was in a different place then, and I've been talking a lot about my story since then. I've been telling my story in lots of different ways, with different angles, to different audiences, and yeah, just being in that kind of different place has helped with that. Maybe I can see things more objectively. I think also working for Bowel Research UK, so working for a charity in a position that's adjacent to research, has given me what I call in the book kind of exposure therapy to other like just various conditions and studies and things that are maybe close to my own but not too close, so that has helped. And I think I've definitely changed over the years, and that has helped with the editing process. And of course having Chris's feedback as well has been really helpful. And the editor image that I read out at the beginning, that was kind of he said, "Oh yeah, you should really like dig into that and flesh that out." So that's the result of that too. And also thinking more closely about the metaphors that I use. And yes, this is a good metaphor or a good way of saying things, but is it relevant to me? For example, I was thinking CMMRD is ultra rare, kind of like how you have like a marathon, you have an ultra marathon, you have your rare diseases and your ultra rare diseases. So I kind of alluded to that, but actually I don't I don't like running. I'm not a runner. So is that the best metaphor to use if the book is going to be about my experiences and it's just thinking about that kind of thing? So we're just over kind of half an hour, and those are all the questions that I have. So I think all that's left to say is thank you so much for coming. I think that this will be live, will be saved on YouTube. It's been a long time since I did a YouTube live. But anyway, yes, so here's the book again in all its glory, minus the not for resale markings. It's available on Amazon in paperback and on Kindle. So just search for the CMMRD book or take a look at my socials. The link is there as well. And on my website, which is writersam.co.uk. If you want to chat to me about anything, you can DM me. My DMs are open on Twitter. I'm on most of the socials at writersamr. So Twitter, Instagram, Threads, and Facebook as well. And you can email me as well, writer.sam@outlook.com. So thank you so much for coming and for watching this back. If you read the book, I hope you enjoy it. If you do read the book, please do leave a review, because it would be so helpful to find out what everybody thinks, and for other people who might want to read it as well. So thanks a lot, and I hope you enjoy, and I'll see you soon.